Okay, so when we open this program called Minitab, the key thing to note, I guess, is that there are two windows that we can see. One is a worksheet window and the other is a session window. So the session window keeps a log of everything we do. The data sheet tells us the data that we're working with. We then have a very old-fashioned set of menus up here that give us all the options we might want to work with. The key thing to note is that when it comes to the worksheet, we've recorded one row for every data sample. So here somebody took a sample from the source location, measured the oxygen, the conductivity, the pH, phosphate and the nitrate on that particular sample. Move down a row, same recordings but on a different sample of water. And then by the time we're at row 6, this is a particular sample that was removed from that location, and at that location we recorded again the same variables. So we basically end up with what looks like a column with a lot of duplication because it's identifying that the source is the place we took the samples from, but then we have a single column that tells us everything about the dissolved oxygen that was recorded all along the River Tamar. This is really the key idea behind using Minitab or bits of software like Minitab, that we have one row per observation. Once we have the data correctly set up, it's very easy to get out the kind of graphs and summary statistics we might be interested in. So the kind of thing we could do, for instance, we have a set of menus up here. Perhaps the two we'll use the most are the stat menu and the graph menu, but I can go to the graph menu. Because this is a small data set, I could select an individual value plot and it's giving me a set of choices, but of course I'm only interested in looking at one variable at a time, and I know that there's a grouping structure. I want to see how it is, how the measurements vary according to the places I took samples. So by default it's giving me a set of the numerical variables I can graph. So we'll have a look at phosphate. Select phosphate and it enters into the box to be graphed. If I then put the cursor in the categorical variables box, it gives me the option of adding location. So I click on location, select, and I now have the ingredients to produce a graph that's going to show me how phosphate varies by location. Click on OK, and it takes a wild guess as to appropriate axes, labels and title. We can copy this all into a word processor and change those and improve those, but at least it tells us what we're doing. And we can see at a glance one of the key features: the variability of phosphate at each location looks roughly comparable. A little bit more variation there, maybe a little bit less variation there, maybe, but nothing hugely different. If I want to turn that into some summary statistics, I can apply the same kind of logic: stat, basic statistics, display descriptive statistics, and I can say, well, it was phosphate I was interested in. That goes in the top box, and then the grouping goes in the lower box, and I click on OK, and now in my output screen it gives me a whole load of information. It tells me there were 5 recordings, 5 rows had information from group DB, none of them had missing data for that variable, and it then tells me information such as the mean, it tells me the standard deviation, and it gives me a little bit of information on quantiles, median, minimum values and maximum values. Maybe they're not the displays I was most interested in. I have something called an interval plot, and again, similar to the pattern we've seen before, one y variable with groups, and I can ask again, look at phosphate and let's see how it varies by group. and I now get a plot of the sample mean plus or minus about 2 standard deviations, which is giving me a 95% confidence interval for the mean. Perhaps for a larger data set, it might be worth mentioning an appropriate plot to produce would be the box plot, and again the logic is identical. There's a grouping structure in the data. I'm interested in phosphate and I want to see how it varies by location, and I click on OK, and this gives me some sense of the median, the upper and lower quartiles, and I can see looks like there's less variation at the source, but there doesn't seem to be hugely different amounts of variation at each location. So I can produce a number of visuals appropriate to the data set that give me some idea what a typical value is, what the variation's like at each location, and we can also obtain the summary statistics.